Hi class. Today we'll discuss the integumentary system, which is basically your skin and nails and hair and all of the glands that are associated with that. And so let's start. Okay, so what is skin? Skin is actually an organ. So when we usually think of an organ, we think of kind of like a liver as an organ, the brain as an organ, but really don't think of skin as an organ, but it is. It is actually the largest organ in the body by weight. So if we collect all of that skin and weigh it, it is the heaviest of all of our organs. It is also known as the cutaneous membrane, and which again is just a fancy term for skin. And the whole system is made out of not just the skin, but the accessory structures. And those accessory structures are hair, nails, glands, so we'll be talking about sweat glands and sebaceous glands, and also sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are the nerve endings that are found in our skin that allow us to feel different things. For example, pain, temperature, touch, and so on. Our skin is made out of two different layers, and the outer layer is known as the epidermis, that is made out of epithelium, and the second layer, or the deeper of the two layers, is known as the dermis, and that is made out of connective tissue. So if you take a look at this histological slide or picture under a microscope of the skin, the top layer is known as the epidermis. That's the outer layer, and as we know from chapter 3, I believe it is, it's made out of, chapter 5. It's made out of stratified squamous epithelium and overlying that basement membrane. The basement membrane is basically the line that separates the epidermis above it from the connective tissue, or the dermis, underneath it. Now the dermis, which in its own is also made out of two different parts, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So the dermis is the deeper of the two layers. It's made out of areolar connective tissue on top and dense irregular connective tissue on the bottom. It has lots of collagen and elastic fibers, and these elastic fibers gives our skin the elasticity. As we age, we kind of lose that elastic fiber and we lose skin elasticity. Underneath those two layers, there is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous. So sub means underneath and cutaneous again means skin. It is not a skin layer, okay? So this is the layer that is underneath the skin. It's made out of adipose tissue, which is basically fat cells. So you can see all of these circles are fat cells. It's underneath both the epidermis and dermis, and you'll find lots of all of the blood vessels are going to be coming from that layer and then branching off to the to the dermis. And here you can get a better picture of all of these different layers. So that darker wavy line is the basement membrane. And above it again is your epidermis, and we'll talk about the different layers of the epidermis. Again, that basement membrane separates the epidermis on top from the dermis underneath it. And you can see these elevations in the dermis. Those are known as the papilla is one, so the dermal papilla. Plural would be dermal papillae. And this is what gives our fingers the very unique fingerprints. Okay, so that kind of reflects on what we see on the outside. In the dermis, we have, again, the most superficial layer of the dermis is made out of areolar connective tissue. And then deeper to that, we have the biggest, or the biggest of the two layers, and that is made out of the dense irregular connective tissue. Within the dermis, you see that it's a very busy area. It has the hair follicle with the related sebaceous glands. We will know that sebaceous glands are related to hair follicles, so what the parts of the body or the parts of the skin that do have hair will have sebaceous glands, while parts of the body that do not have hair, for example, the palms and the soles, are not going to have sebaceous glands. We also see this smooth muscle, the erector pili muscle, and that is a smooth muscle fiber, and it can lead to goosebumps when it contracts. So when it contracts, it'll pull on that hair shaft, leading to what we see on the outside as goosebumps. We can also see within the dermis, we can see the branching of the blood vessels, so the red arteries and the blue veins, and you can see all of these yellow structures, those are nerve endings. I also want to show you the sweat glands. So you can see sweat glands, and as they open up, if you follow these ducts, all of them are going to open up on the outer surface, all the way in the epidermis. Same here with this sweat gland. If you follow the duct, it opens all the way. The pores are going to be out here on the epidermis. Underneath both layers, again, we have your hypodermis, which is made out of the adipose tissue, also known as a subcutaneous layer, which is not a layer of the skin. Again, this is where the blood vessels are coming from, and then they branch out into the dermis. Notice that there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. Okay, so if we get a paper cut, they might be very painful, but sometimes they will not bleed, and that would be because the paper cut, if it's not deep enough, okay, and it cuts only the layers of the epidermis, then we really did not reach the layers. We didn't reach any blood vessels. So in order to bleed, the cut has to go through all of the layers of the epidermis and get into the dermis. Okay, so this is basically, a lot of what we were talking about. Okay, so the epidermis is made out of stratified squamous epithelium. It's right on top of the basement membrane. It has no blood vessels, so again, go back and kind of think of that paper cut. We'll talk about the different layers of the epidermis, but the deepest layer is known as the stratum basale. Stratum means layer, basal means basal. Okay, so that's the basal layer. And this is where, okay, let me go back to the picture to illustrate this. So that is the darkest on this image, okay, not for real, just on the image. It's the darkest layer right here. It's the wavy one. And you see that it's the closest to the blood vessels. And this layer is where a lot of mitosis and a lot of cell division is happening. And as these cells divide, it'll start pushing the other layers further away from the blood vessels. So the layers that are on top get less oxygen. Now these cells tend to die off gradually until at the very top we have this keratinized layer of cells that are fully dead, and they have been replaced with a protein known as keratin. And we can illustrate that on our own skin. If you scratch any surface of the skin that has not been, that doesn't have any lotion on it, you can see some white cells. Okay, those are the dead keratinized cells that are found all the way on the top. So as we said, the cells grow, they migrate towards the free surface, which is the outer surface, and that would be further away from the blood vessels, so further away from the oxygen supply. And as they get further away, they start to die off and they become keratinized, and we call them keratinocytes. So cyte is a cell, keratin means that these cells are now full of keratin. And that's the whole process is known as keratinization, which is basically that dying off of these cells, they have become dehydrated, they're dead, there is accumulation of a protein known as keratin in them, and that again tends to slough off later on. The keratin is that waterproof protein, again, that is found at the outermost layer. Okay, and we call that layer of keratinized cell, we call that stratum corneum. Now the stratum corneum will eventually shed from your skin surface, and it's actually used in forensics. Okay, so, one of the things, what type of evidence that forensics will try to look for would be some of these corneum cells, stratum corneum cells that have been sloughed off by maybe, the criminal, and they try to find it on the different surfaces in the crime scene. Okay, this epidermis is thickest in the palms and soles. Okay, so we're talking about the epidermis as a whole, not this keratinized layer, but epidermis as a whole is the thickest on the palms and the soles. And while the rest of the body has kind of like a thinner epidermis, and we'll understand why that is. The palms and soles of the feet have 5 layers in the epidermis, while the rest of the body only has 4. So we already talked about the stratum corneum. So these are the layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep, or from top to bottom. We already talked about the stratum corneum. Those again are your outermost layer. They're dead keratinized cells. And then underneath it, there is a stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum, which are these very pale cells, okay, and those are found only in the palms and soles. Okay, so that layer, if it is found, that means that you're looking at a piece of skin from the palm and sole. If it is not there, then it could be from any other part of the body. The stratum granulosum, this is really a layer of cell where, it is a little bit further away from the blood supply, and it is already starting to die off, and you can kind of see these little granules, and hence the name granulosum. The stratum spinosum, okay, which is basically the thickest one of them. And then the deepest one, that's the stratum basale, or the germinatum cell. And this again is the deepest, and this is where all the mitosis is happening. These are the ones that are closest to the oxygen or to the blood supply, and that's why they are always undergoing mitosis. So your skin cells are really shields, and it's really your first line of defense against pathogens. When we get to the immune system, we'll learn that there are different lines of defense, and one of the first lines of defense would be the skin, where it prevents these invaders. It prevents these germs from getting into the body. Here's a little table that has all the layers of the epidermis. Okay, no new information on there. It's just in a table format as opposed to in a paragraph format. Within the epidermal cells, we also have cells known as melanocytes, and these cells make melanin. They are found all the way at the level of the stratum basale, and they produce a pigment known as melanin, which is protective against ultraviolet rays. And you can see here that the more the melanin it makes, the more it will penetrate into the different layers of the epidermis. Melanin, the amount of melanin that is made can change depending on exposure to sun, and we'll talk about different factors that can increase melanin production. Okay, it's again, it is protective against DNA damage, fibroblast damage, and skin cancer. So the more melanin that we produce, the more we're protected from these different things. Okay, so these are the things that affect our skin color. Okay, some of them are genetics, where it all depends on the amount of melanin. The number of melanocytes, though, are constant. So no matter no matter what color of skin we have, the number of these melanocytes are the same. We just differ on how much melanin is being produced. Okay, the more the melanin, again, the more distribution within the epidermis, and we call these melanin granules. There is a genetic disorder known as albinism, where there's a mutation in the gene that produces melanin, and in these individuals there would be a whole total lack of melanin, and which exposes them to all of these dangers. Now they are not protected from DNA damage and so on. There are also environmental factors that affect our skin color, like sunlight. Okay, so if you go get tanning and so on, that could change our skin color. Ultraviolet light from sun lamps and X-rays can also change skin color. And then there are physiological factors. Okay, so let's say, for example, you're running and then the blood vessels dilate, and that brings a lot of blood into the area. Now that will lead to a pinkish color of the skin. Or let's say there's not enough oxygen reaching the skin. So that can lead to bluish discoloration known as cyanosis. In the condition of jaundice, for instance, that is known as the yellowish discoloration of skin. We already talked about how the blood vessels of the skin, if they dilate, that could lead to flushing and redness of the skin, while vasoconstriction can lead to being pale. And there is such thing as accumulation of a keratin pigment from diet. So carrots, are very rich in keratin, okay, which gives carrots their very unique orange color. So if somebody eats way too much of that, that can lead to accumulation of that pigment and leading to that change in skin color. So what about indoor tanning and skin cancer? Exposure to sunlight or tanning beds can lead to the melanocytes to produce more melanin and lead to skin darkening, but overuse of the ultraviolet radiation can sometimes overwhelm the body, and melanocytes are supposed to protect us from that, but if you overwork them, okay, the protection is going to fail, okay, so you kind of lost that protection. Melanomas arise from melanocytes, while the kinds of cancers that arise from the epithelial cells are either basal cell carcinoma from the stratum basale or squamous cell carcinoma from the rest of the epidermis. Okay, although these are more common, okay, melanomas are more lethal. Okay, so melanomas only make up about 4% of skin cancers, but they do cause about 80% of deaths due to skin cancers. Now for the dermis, we already talked about that it is connective tissue. It's made out of two different layers. The layer on top is made out of areolar connective tissue. And we talked about the dermal papilla. Again, dermal papilla is singular. Dermal papillae would be the plural. And these ridges are found between the dermis, dermis and the epidermis, and they provide these together with the epidermal ridges, which are kind of like the parts where they fit into the epidermis. These are the basis of our fingerprints. Okay. Within the dermis, this is where you'll find all of the action. So we have our hair follicles, the sebaceous glands attached to them, the smooth muscle fiber. We also have tons of nerve endings, blood vessels, and sweat glands. So let's introduce some of the receptors that we have. We have what are known as the lamellated or the Pacinian corpuscles for pressure, and the tactile or Meissner's corpuscles for light touch. So you'll find the tactile ones that are more superficial. Okay, so these ones right here are tactile corpuscles for light touch, while the lamellated are going to be deeper within the skin. So you could see this one right here. That is for pressure, which makes sense. So if you are touching something, you'll stimulate the superficial receptors. But if you press on it a little bit harder, now you'll stimulate these deeper receptors. Okay, so the two layers of the dermis, we have the superficial or the papillary layer, and again, it's made out of the areolar connective tissue. We already talked about the dermal papillae. While the deeper of the two is the reticular layer, and it's made out of dense irregular connective tissue. So what are the accessory structures of the skin? Okay, accessory structures, these originate, you'll find them all in the epidermis, okay? And they originate in the epidermis, but they extend into the dermis or even into the hypodermis. The accessory structures are hair, follicles, nails, and the skin glands, namely sweat and sebaceous glands. If these, in the case of injury or in case of burns, if these accessory structures remain intact, the injured area can regenerate itself, okay? So these accessory structures have stem cells that have the ability to regenerate But again, it all depends on whether they have been spared or damaged. So first off, we'll talk about nails. Okay, these are the protective coverings that are found at the tips of the fingers and toes. And there are three different parts of the nail that we want to know of. There's the nail plate, and that is, most of the nail that we can see on the outside, and it lies right on top of the nail bed. The nail bed is the skin that is found underneath the nail plate. There's also the lunula, or if you look at your own fingers, you'll find like this little half moon shaped at the base of the nail that is lighter in color. Okay, and it extends even underneath the skin. Okay, and this is how the nail regenerates. Okay, so again, you want this, if somebody loses a nail for any reason, if this part remains intact, the nail has the ability to regenerate. And you can see here the extension of the lunula underneath the skin. Now for the hair follicles are actually invaginations or depressions of the epidermis into the dermis. So I'll show you how that works. So right here is your epidermis, and then if you follow the surface, it invaginates all the way down and goes back up in order to continue as the rest of the epidermis. Okay, so whatever goes on in these layers is also going on right here, which means that all of these dead cells right here, these keratinized cells that we slough off as we walk around, well, that's not going to happen in this case because they're deeply embedded within the dermis. What happens is that these cells tend to kind of get glued together and they are pushed out, and now we see them on the outside as the hair shaft. So the hair shaft are keratinized cells. So when you read about the hair follicle being a tube-like depression of epidermal cells, now you kind of understand how that works. The three parts of the hair, we have the hair bulb, and those are the dividing cells. There's the hair root, okay, and again, this is where kind of like these cells are kind of getting glued together. And then there's the hair shaft, and that's the part that we see on the outside. We also have this little dip right here, and that is known as the hair papilla, and that's where the blood supply is coming from because, again, just like cells that need nourishment, the rest of the layers here need nourishment as well. We also have, depending on the amount of melanin being produced, that will determine hair color. And with each hair follicle, there is going to be a smooth muscle fiber known as the arrector pili muscle. And when that contracts, again, we can see that this hair shaft will become straight, and we see that in the form of goosebumps. So let's talk a little bit about clinical applications here. So hair loss. The most common kind of hair loss is known as androgenic alopecia. So alopecia means loss of hair. Androgenic means it is generated due to androgens or testosterone. And it is obviously more common in men, even the name implies that, and it is associated with testosterone in men. It can occur in women though, and when it does, it tends to occur after menopause, okay, where relatively the levels of estrogen and progesterone are now, have now dropped. Okay, this is the most common cause of baldness, but there are other kinds, and that is one of them is known as alopecia areata, and that is an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease means that the immune system lost the ability or cannot recognize the body's own cells. So let's say, for example, my immune system thinks that my hair follicles are foreign bodies, okay, and start attacking it. That should not be the case, okay? My immune system should be able to identify my hair follicles as mine and that they're not foreign and not attack them. And that is what an autoimmune disorder is, where, again, the failure of the immune system to recognize its own cells, and now it believes that these cells are invaders, they're foreign cells, and the immune cells start attacking them. Generally speaking, autoimmune disorders are more common in females. So alopecia areata tends to also be more common in females. And again, the body is producing antibodies attacking the hair follicles. Now we'll talk a little bit about skin glands. So the first one are sebaceous glands, and these are holocrine glands. So from, last week we learned the different kinds of glands, and we should know that a holocrine gland, what that means. Okay, these sebaceous glands are going to be associated with hair follicles, so you won't find sebaceous glands in areas of the skin that do not have hair. They produce sebum, which is basically fat, with some cellular debris, with some parts of the actual cells. The sebum keeps the hair and the skin soft, and it also waterproofs it. So it's kind of like a protective layer to prevent the extra loss of water from our bodies. But on the other hand, too much sebum can lead to acne. So it could, and we'll talk about that, I believe, in the next slide. Okay, as I said, sebaceous glands are not found in non-hairy areas, so you will not find them in the palms and the soles. So acne, or acne vulgaris, is the correct term. That is a disorder of the sebaceous glands. It usually starts at puberty, although it could, run all the way through 30s, sometimes even into the 40s. It affects about 80% of people, and it is due to the clogging of the sebaceous glands due to extra sebum, especially if it is thick. And so there is the clogging by the thick, dry sebum and the epithelial cells. And that clogging leads to the growth of bacteria, usually anaerobes, which are bacteria that do not need oxygen. And that leads to inflammation that can be very painful sometimes. So how do we treat these? Well, usually by antibiotics, okay, to kind of get rid of the bacteria. And then you want systemic antibiotics, meaning oral, okay, so not local antibiotics. And then you want vitamin A derivatives. Vitamin A is an antioxidant and it is an anti-inflammatory, so it decreases the inflammation in the area. Salicylic acid, which is basically the chemical component of aspirin, but it's in a creamy form or an ointment. So salicylic acid and benzoyl peroxide, both of these tend to act like scrubs, where you're scrubbing away the excess cellular debris and opening up the pores. Next on our list of skin glands are sweat glands. Okay, and we also call sweat glands, we call them sudoriferous glands, meaning that they secrete a kind of a watery-like secretion. They are found throughout the skin. Okay, you'll see that they originate deep within the dermal layers, and then again, they open up in the epidermis. We actually have two different kinds of sweat glands. So the sweat glands that produce, the sweat that we're kind of used to, that help regulate body temperature, those are known as the eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. These are the most of the sweat glands in the body, again, distributed throughout the whole body, and these respond to elevated body temperature. The apocrine sweat glands, on the other hand, those are, first off, they're found more deep within the skin. They are also related mostly to hair follicles, not necessarily, but they can. And these secrete by a process of exocytosis. These are related to puberty, okay? So apocrine, kind of remember that they are related to puberty. They start becoming active during puberty. So if you have, say, a sibling or a cousin that's going through puberty, you'll start noticing that their sweat has this different odor to it. And so apocrine sweat glands are responsible for body odor. And again, they are found in the areas related to puberty. So like in the axillary areas and the growing areas, as they are, the pubic hair and the axillary hair are growing, these sweat glands start to become active and leading to that body odor. Okay, again, these are also the ones that respond to emotions and pain. So if we're nervous, for example, and you feel all sweaty in the armpits, these are the sweat glands that are working. Now our ceruminous glands, these are the glands that produce wax in the ear, and these are modified sweat glands. So these are sweat glands. that instead of producing sweat, they have been changed in a way where they are now producing wax. Same thing goes for mammary glands that produce milk in the breast. Here again is a table of all of the different skin glands. You could kind of go through this, the description, the function of each of the glands, and the location. So this is a good time to take a break. First off though, I got a mnemonic that I kind of want to share with everybody. So the layers of the skin, the layers of the epidermis, remember, this is an important thing to remember. The layers are in order: corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal, and again known from superficial to deep, which would be come, let's get sunburned. So again, this is a good time to go on that little break and come back. So welcome back, and we will keep on going. So now for skin functions. Well, skin is really important for homeostasis. Okay, function of the skin, remember we said it's the first barrier. So it's, it kind of helps the immune system. Okay, it's really important for regulation of body temperature due to the production of sweat and the vasodilation or the constriction of blood vessels. It has, sweat also has some waste products. So not only is it just water, there are some waste products in there as well. It has sensory receptors. Okay, so we do feel different things using our skin. And skin also helps in the production of vitamin D. So how is it that skin helps with regulation of body temperature? The thermostat for temperature is found in the hypothalamus, and it's set to a set point. Okay, that set point, and you want to know both numbers, whether in Celsius or in Fahrenheit. So in Celsius, it's 37 degrees. In Fahrenheit, it's 98.6. Okay, in medicine, most things in documentation and so on, a lot of this goes with Celsius, especially if you're going to start reading, different research papers and so on. You want to be familiar with the Celsius system. So 37 degrees is within normal range. It's obviously a range, but this is kind of an average. And Fahrenheit is about 98.6. And skin is definitely one of the important organs that help with the homeostasis and body temperature. So generally speaking, how does our body produce heat and how does it lose heat? So heat production is due to cellular metabolism, okay? And the organ that produces the most heat of the body would actually be the heart. So the contractions, the continuous pumping of the heart, produces the most heat, and it will distribute that heat with the bloodstream. Okay, so our major heat producers are cardiac muscle is actually number one, skeletal muscle, and then cells of the liver, because the liver is a very active organ. Now, what happens if the body gets too warm? The blood vessels in the skin, okay, so, kind of emphasizing that these are the blood vessels of the skin, are going to dilate. Okay, so that the blood can now kind of get diverted towards the surface of the body so that we could get rid of all of that extra heat through radiation or the different other heat loss methods that we'll talk about. Okay, and we will constrict the deep blood vessels. So again, blood has all of that heat that was just generated in the heart. So to get rid of all of that extra heat that we might not need if the body is too warm, the body dilates. The hypothalamus would send orders to the skin to dilate the dermal blood vessels and constrict the deep blood vessels. So maybe constrict the blood vessels going to the intestine and to the bladder and so on, and take that heat from our deep core parts of the body and divert it over to the skin. Now we will start losing more heat. And the ways that we lose heat would be either by radiation, which means pretty much that we're just, heat rays escaping from our body. So even without touching a person, if you get too close to a person, you could start feeling their heat. Okay, so that's radiation. And that's the primary way we lose heat. So you can see how it would be beneficial if that blood is diverted towards the surface. There's also conduction, which would be the transfer of heat between two solid surfaces. So if you sit down in a cold chair, for example, give it a couple of minutes, now your body heat will be conducted to that seat. Convection would be heat loss by the circulating air. So standing in front of a fan, for example, can lead to loss of heat. And then evaporation, which would be due to sweat. And that sweat, as it evaporates, it's going to carry a lot of the heat away. So what happens in the two different scenarios? And I believe we kind of talked about this, but there's no harm in discussing it again. So again, our normal body temperature levels, where the thermostat is in the hypothalamus. So what happens if the body temperature gets too high? Well, we'll stimulate the thermoreceptors. Okay, that is going to send signals to your hypothalamus. It'll dilate the blood vessels of the skin, constrict the blood vessels in the deeper parts of the body, and it'll start activating the sweat glands to produce more sweat. Okay, so in order to, again, with these changes, we'll, in an attempt to get the body temperature back down to normal. Well, let's say the body temperature falls. So the opposite scenario, let's say we're out in the cold weather. Again, we're stimulating these thermoreceptors. The hypothalamus receives that signal and it'll do the opposite. Okay, it'll constrict the dermal blood vessels, it'll deactivate the sweat glands, and it'll start the shivering process of muscle contraction. It's an involuntary process. So what about a couple of problems in temperature regulation? So hyperthermia versus hypothermia. Hyperthermia is an abnormally high body temperature. Okay, and I'll give you a scenario to kind of explain how hyperthermia can happen. So let's say somebody's jogging or running a marathon in a very hot, humid day. So that person is sweating. So the body is trying to bring their temperature back down to normal, but it's very humid. Okay, so that sweat is not evaporating, it's not going anywhere. They're not drinking enough water, so all of that water that they just lost is not being compensated for. And that means that this person will get dehydrated as time goes by. They are going to lose all of that water, and now they have no extra water to sweat. So as long as they're sweating, they're fine. It's when the person stops sweating, that's when we start to worry. Okay, so the skin becomes dry. That means that the thermostat pretty much is damaged. The person starts to get weak and dizzy, nauseous, they feel like they want to throw up, headaches, and a very pulsating headaches and a very rapid or fast pulse. Okay, and all of these are really due to the dehydration that's occurring. Now for hypothermia, so in that condition, you want to rehydrate the person and, kind of, if they're in layers, you want to maybe take off some of those layers so that they could, start radiating some of that extra heat. Okay, for hypothermia, which is abnormally low body temperature, so we'll go to a very different scenario where somebody maybe is stuck in, snowy areas. Okay, so leading to these prolonged exposure to cold. The shivering is going to occur, which is the involuntary contraction of the skeletal muscles, but that is obviously, if it fails, okay, due to, the prolonged exposure to that very cold weather, that is going to gradually progress to confusion. They become lethargic, which means, they're kind of unaware of time and place and so on. They start losing their reflexes. Okay, so the nervous system starts to shut down, and that can even lead to loss of consciousness and death. And because of that, without any treatment, so without, if you find these individuals, you want to warm them up, wrap them with blankets, and so on. Organs can shut down if that doesn't happen. And the danger of hypothermia is that all of the enzymes in our body, in order to function, they can only function within a certain body temperature. If that body temperature gets too low, these enzymes shut down. So we'll talk a little bit more about elevated body temperature, which is the loss of the homeostatic control. Okay, so again, our hypothalamus can work to fix things, but within a limit. If we, push it a little bit too far, we overwhelm the system and that leads to chaos. So the body heat can build up really fast. Okay, we're unable to lose all of that extra heat. And all of that vasodilation of the skin, blood vessels, to get rid of that extra heat can lead to severe hypotension. So we will learn in the cardiovascular system that when blood vessels dilate, that means you are lowering the blood pressure. Extreme vasodilation, which would happen if the system is being pushed to the limits due to this high temperature, can lead to collapse of the cardiovascular system too. Okay, and that is obviously fatal, can be fatal. So why is it that we get fevers? Why should we consider a fever a good thing or a bad thing? And how is it that we get a fever? How is it that germs or pathogens stimulate a fever? Okay, what happens is that our immune system, when they recognize that there is a pathogen or an invader in our body, they are going to change the thermostat. Okay, so the thermostat in the hypothalamus is set to those set points that we talked, those numbers that we mentioned. But our immune system, as soon as they recognize an invader, they are going to change that set point. Okay, so instead of being set at these different numbers that we talked about, 98.6, it'll change the number to say 101. So now the body is going to elevate the body temperature to 101 as opposed to 98. The phagocytes, which are your, phago means to eat and cyte means cells. So these are the eating cells that are going to start attacking the different organisms or different antigens, which are the germs. Some of them release pyrogens. Gen means to generate, and pyro means fever or fire. So these are known as the endogenous pyrogens or the heat generating chemicals. When they see these phagocytes, when they find bacteria or viruses or whatever, organism trying to invade the body, they will release these pyrogens, and pyrogens again are going to change the set point within the hypothalamus. The elevated body temperature, a fever, up to a limit obviously, fevers are a good thing because fever helps in destroying pathogens. So how is it that our skin has the ability to heal and do all of our wounds and burns heal? So for inflammation is a normal response to injury or stress. Inflammation, there is a difference between inflammation and infection. Infection means that there is a germ, a bacteria, or a virus involved, okay? Inflammation would be, let's say you get hit and the area swells up, okay? So there is no germ there, but there is still, redness and swelling and pain, okay? That is inflammation. Infection, again, is different. You still have these signs, but it has to also have a pathogen involved. There has to be a bug involved. Okay, inflammation is the body's way of trying to prevent the spread of different diseases and spread of infection. And what happens is that in an area of inflammation, the blood vessels dilate. Okay, when blood vessels dilate, the little pores open up, and that leads to leaking of fluids from the blood vessels into these inflamed areas. Now you can find that inflamed skin can become red, swollen, warm, and painful. So the signs of inflammation are, to remember, are RSWP as opposed to RSVP. So redness, swelling, warm, and pain. And here you can see the different signs of inflammation, which are heat, redness, so redness right here, swelling, pain, and loss of function. So we'll talk about, cuts and how they heal. Okay, different things, well, it depends on how deep the cut is. So if it's shallow, like that paper cut, where you only affect the epidermis, which is, it'll be very painful because it does have the nerve endings, but it might not bleed, or it's not going to bleed because there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. Okay, that is very easily heal. The epidermis is a very highly mitotic, are very highly mitotic cells. Those will multiply rapidly and heal that gap, to fill the gap. A deep cut, on the other hand, will heal, but there's a little bit more to it. So that would be reaching the dermis or even the subcutaneous layer. Okay, the blood vessels are going to start leaking blood, and that blood, the bleeding has to stop first in order for the healing to start. So we'll make a blood clot first. And I just kind of got this little image of a blood clot from chapter 14. So a blood clot is basically fibrin, all of that, all these little threads with blood cells entangled within the fibrin. So usually RBCs that are tangled in there. Okay, platelets are obviously involved in making a blood clot, and we'll definitely learn a lot more about that when we get to that chapter. Okay, so the clot on the top is going to dry and become, we'll call that the scab. And the scab is going to protect everything that's happening underneath. So we really do not, especially in kids, we ask them, do not remove the scab, because if you remove the scab, the bleeding starts all over again, and that will delay the healing process. So that scab is really protecting what's happening underneath it in order for the healing process to complete. And when it does, the scab will fall on its own. So I'm going to go kind of to the next slide to explain how things go. So right here is that deep wound that cut the epidermis and dermis. You can see that the blood vessels, are leaking the blood, are also leaking white blood cells. Okay, so when the dead tissue that was just cut in this area, they are going to release chemicals. And these chemicals are going to call in. They're kind of like, they release different chemicals, and these chemicals are kind of like red flags that there's something wrong going on in this area. We need the immune system. So these white blood cells are going to come into the area to make sure, they'll do a lot of different things. First off, they will get rid of any germs that are trying to invade through that wound. They will also get rid of the dead tissue. So all of that dead cellular debris, we have to get rid of that in order to build healthy tissue. So you kind of want to think of it as, say, you're demolishing a house and building a new one. Before you build a new one, you have to get rid of all of that debris. And that's exactly what the white blood cells will do. We have phagocytic cells, which are basically neutrophils and macrophages. Again, if you're not familiar with the cells for now, just you kind of be familiar at least with the name. So macrophages, macro means huge, phage means to eat. So these are cells that eat up cellular debris. They have the ability to eat up germs. So again, they'll protect us from any invaders. They will also start getting rid of the cellular debris. And another kind of cell comes in, and those are fibroblasts. Fibroblasts, you will always find that one of the first cells that come into any damaged area, besides the immune cells, are going to be fibroblasts. So these white blood cells remove and protect. The fibroblasts are going to start laying down fibrous tissue in order to build that scar tissue. And even the name kind of tells you what it does, okay? So fibro is fibrous. Blast means to make something. So you'll find that a lot of the cells that we'll be talking about are named, say, fibroblast, okay? So to make fiber. Or osteoblast means to make osseous tissue, which are bones. Okay, and we'll be familiar with all of these different cells as we go. And you can see that blood clot or the scab on top, again, protecting everything that's happening here. And gradually, these fibroblasts are laying down a fibrous tissue, leading to a scar tissue down here. And while on the other hand, the epidermis is bridging that gap. It's multiplying in order to fill that whole gap. And when that occurs, that scab again will fall down. If too much fibrous tissue is made, that could lead to scarring. Next thing to talk about are different burns. Now, burns are classified according to how much tissue damage happened. First degree, second, and third degree burns. A first degree burn is a superficial, known as a superficial partial thickness burn, where the burn only happened in the epidermis. So, for example, sunburn. Okay, that can heal within days to weeks without any scarring. While a second degree burn is known as a deep partial thickness, where the epidermis is destroyed and so is a little bit of the dermis. So, for example, being burned with hot liquid. Okay, the kind of like diagnostic sign of a second degree burn would be the occurrence of blisters. So if there is a blister, we are no longer in that first degree burn. We are definitely in at least a second degree burn. Again, the healing all depends on the survival of the stem cells that we said are found within the accessory organs. So in the hair, in the sebaceous glands, in the hair follicles, and so on. So if those remain intact, will be able to regenerate skin, and these individuals will be able to recover with no scarring. But I'm going to kind of say that quote unquote because usually scars do happen initially, and then it takes 6 months, maybe up to a couple of years until the skin gets back to its normal color. But eventually, a second degree burn will not permanently scar the skin. As for the third degree burn, that is also known as the full thickness burn, where there's the destruction of the epidermis, dermis, and accessory structures. So the destruction of the accessory structures, you have now lost those stem cells and lost the ability to reproduce and regenerate skin. Okay, that can can result from either prolonged exposure to flames or hot liquids. And there might be some healing from the margins, but if there is a gap, a lot of times these patients would need a skin grafting. Okay, and there are different kinds of skin graft out there. And if you have watched any, kind of medically oriented TV shows like Grey's Anatomy or so, whenever they have a burn patient, they will say, well, what is the degree of burn or how much of the body has been burned? And they say that in a percentage. So we try to estimate how much of the body was burned, and that helps us figure out, first of all, what are the survival rates and what is the treatment plan. Okay, so from this estimate, we plan how much fluid do we need to replace, how much electrolytes, and again, the chances of survival. So there's a rule in order to calculate how much of the surface area of the skin was burned, and we call that the rule of nines. And this applies to adults. Okay, there's a separate rule for kids that we're not going to be talking about, but the rule of nines, this applies to adults, where we've pretty much divided the body into areas, and each area is 9% of the surface area, or a multiple of that 9%. Okay, so we'll take it kind of from top to bottom. So the head, front and back, would be 9%. Okay, the anterior part of the trunk is 18%. So the upper part is 9, lower part is 9. Posterior trunk is 18. Again, upper part 9%, lower part 9%. Each upper limb is 9%. So you see 4.5 in the front and 4.5 in the back. While if you compare that to the lower limbs, because the lower limbs are bigger, the one surface of the lower limb, so anterior part is 9%, while the posterior part of the lower limb is 9%. Okay, so if you add all that up, it adds up to 99%, and the remaining 1% is the perineal area. So for instance, let's say somebody comes in and they have maybe a burn in the anterior part of the left upper limb and the anterior portion of the left lower limb. So we will calculate that as 4.5 plus 9%, which would be this patient has burns in 13.5% of the surface area of their skin. So what are the lifespan changes that happen to the whole system? You kind of want to think of, every single part of the system and think what happens to it as we age. So skin starts to become dry. So the sebaceous glands, for instance, they decrease the production of sebum. Age spots start to appear. There is thinning of the epidermis and dermis, thinning or loss of the fat in the subcutaneous layer, together with, where did it go? Together with the decline in the sensory receptors and the decline in the regulation of body temperature, that leads to a lot of our seniors feeling a lot colder than they should be. Okay, so for example, I remember when my grandmother was in a nursing home, it would be July and she would be wrapped up because she was freezing, where we would all be sweating. So, all of the changes that are happening in her skin, the loss of the subcutaneous fat with a decline in the sensory receptors, and that loss of body temperature regulation, because of the loss of the functions of the sweat glands and so on, leads to these different changes. Okay, there's obviously wrinkling and sagging of the skin that happens. The sagging occurs due to the loss of the subcutaneous fat. The melanin production slows down, and that leads to hair whitening. And even the hair follicles, we start to lose some of the hair follicles, and that leads to thinning of hair. Nail growth starts to slow down, and the nails become brittle. And there's also the diminished ability to produce vitamin D. That leads to kind of exacerbates the osteoporosis that can happen as we age. Now this concludes this chapter. Let me know if you have any questions.